I have been thinking about hospitality this week. And I know that sounds like a very pious thing for a pastor to be thinking about, but bear with me for a minute. Maybe part of it is the fact that summer is really here, maybe a little more enthusiastically than we wish it were. But it feels like everywhere you look, there are picnics and barbecues and gatherings taking place. There are parties by the lake and one fete after another in town. So that's part of why hospitality is on my mind. But I've also been thinking about Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and about the shining example of hospitality that community is. This is a church that, just a couple of weeks ago, did what they do every Wednesday evening, opening their doors and welcoming in people they knew and people they didn't know. A church that welcomed a stranger to Bible study and paid an unthinkable price for that welcome. It's also a church that, the very next Sunday, just 4 days later, did what it does every Sunday and opened its doors wide for worship. They didn't have to do that, of course. They could have closed down for the week and said, we need a break. We can't be here at the sight of such raw and horrible grief. They could have looked inward and said, this Sunday is just for our members. No strangers, please. This is a day when we need to stick together. They could have become bitter or vengeful. Any of those reactions would have been understandable, justifiable, and very human. But instead, they did what their faith taught them, what they do every Sunday, what they know how to do so well. They opened up the church and welcomed in whoever would come for worship. The assassin had wanted to deepen already painful racial divisions, but the church would have nothing of it. Wrong church, wrong people, wrong day, read the signs. This community knows what it means to live with hospitality and with open-hearted, self-giving love. They practiced it every week, and so when push came to shove, they knew how to keep on doing it, even then. That's what hospitality looks like. Being that open to others and being willing to accept the risk that comes with it. And that's what we're called to. The gospel will remind us again and again and again. It's how Jesus lived, and we can't very well follow him without living that way ourselves. So I think that is one way to hear the story that we heard read from Mark's gospel a few minutes ago, as one of the Bible's many reminders of just how important it is to be hospitable. You never know who that person at your door, or next to you on the bus, or beside you in worship might be. Welcome them, this passage tells us. They might be messengers of great grace. That's the sort of thing we come to expect from the Bible, and for good reason. It's all over the place. From Genesis to the prophets, to the Gospels, to the letters of Paul, welcoming strangers and being people of hospitality, particularly toward those who are different from us, is not optional business. It's a calling on our lives. It's a place where we meet God. That message is everywhere in the Bible, but actually, I think this story wants to do something else. Because in this story, the disciples are not the ones asked to set the table for others. In this story, they are asked to be the guests. Our reading starts with Jesus' rather anticlimactic preaching debut in his hometown of Nazareth. Jesus has been picking up steam in these recent chapters in the Gospel of Mark, getting lots of attention for everything he's doing, his preaching and his healing and his casting out demons and his open confrontations with those who are in power. He now attracts quite a crowd wherever he goes. That reputation goes ahead of him. But when he rolls back into Nazareth and stands up to speak in the synagogue, things do not go well. Out there in the great wide world, Jesus is a prophet and a healer. But here, he's still that kid who grew up on Fig Tree Lane and played with the neighbor children and was doing a fine job of training to be a carpenter like his father. That's who he is to all those familiar faces in the crowd. Where did he get all this? They mumble to one another, and they take offense at his words and his presence. Literally, they stumble over him. Jesus and the disciples all leave town in the wake of that painful homecoming, and it's then that Jesus first sends the 12 out into the world on their own. This is sort of a symbolic action, since sending out disciples into the world is what Jesus and the church are going to be up to for the rest of time. So the details are important. And what's particularly striking to me is the packing list the disciples are given. Now, I've done some backpacking, and I've spent time around some pretty serious backpackers, and I know that packing light is a great virtue. I know backpackers who will shop around for the lightest possible camping stove or cookware, or who will spend days trying to figure out exactly the right combination of clothes to bring so that they are bringing only the essentials. I even know people who will drill holes in the handle of a toothbrush just to shave off a few grams. Packing light is a virtue, and every little bit counts. But even among expert packers, the idea is to pack carefully so that you basically have what you need, so that you will be more or less self-sufficient. You pack enough clothes so that you won't have to do laundry too often. You pack your pocket knife so you won't be left without it. You pack your first aid kit so that you will be prepared for whatever might happen. That is not what Jesus' packing list looks like. Here it is. A staff, needed for fending off wild animals on the road. One tunic, not two. And sandals, since you won't get far without something on your feet. Be sure to bring your authority over unclean spirits, and that's it. Leave the cell phone charger at home, the money belt, and the toothbrush too. It's not much to get by on. In fact, it's pretty clear that the packing list is designed specifically to be inadequate and to make sure that the disciples rely on others. I don't think Jesus is saying, these few things are all you're going to need. Have fun. I think he's saying, this is not all you are going to need. You are going to need to rely on others. Which is pretty strange when you think about it. Because in much of Christian history, the idea of being gracious guests has been all but lost. This is not the Christianity of the Crusades, or of missionaries who barged into communities as though they were the sole bearers of truth in God-forsaken places and cultures. This is not the Christianity of those who use the earth recklessly and pay no attention to the cost. This is not the Christianity that says to others, we have everything that you need. This is a Christianity that admits that we don't have all we need, that in fact we stand in need of others. This is something much more humble, much more open, and much more engaged with the world. Being a guest in this world, and a gracious one, is somehow essential to being a follower of Jesus. And that is not always as easy as it sounds. Sometimes I think it's hard because there's a vulnerability to being a guest. You don't choose whether the meal is squid or tofu. You don't choose the conversation topic alone. You don't stand in the familiar space of your own kitchen, but in someone else's space. And that can be a little unsettling. Sometimes being a guest is hard because of that vulnerability. And sometimes I think it's hard because we know we might be changed by the experience. That might be part of what's been behind the church's frequent reluctance to being a guest as much as a host. So often the church has been pretty good at showing up in a community and saying, more or less, come on in and let us teach you what we believe. Let us teach you what we think. Let us teach you the songs that we sing. And while that's certainly part of being the church, and certainly not something we should give up on, it's only the host part, I think. A church that's also ready to be a guest will not only teach, but it will also learn. Tell us your story, the church will also say. Tell us where you have seen God. Teach us some of your songs. This is actually the example Jesus gives us, you know. In coming to God's people, God could have blown everybody's hair back with capital T truth. God could have spoken with booming words and flashes of lightning, accepting nothing from human beings. But instead, in Jesus, God spent time hanging out at the synagogue, speaking with the folks in Nazareth, and being rejected by them. In Jesus, God lived as one with no place to lay his head, homeless and dependent on the generosity of others. In Jesus, God sat amused in someone's kitchen or asleep in someone's boat, as the hymn we'll sing a little later puts it. In Jesus, God was not only a host at meals, but also a guest, and one who was radically open to the goodness and presence of the divine in others. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying now we should only be in the business of receiving hospitality and should stop offering it. The call to be welcoming hosts is all over the Bible, and Jesus sends the disciples out with authority over unclean spirits and a message the world desperately needs. He means for them to do their work, not simply to accept one invitation for coffee after another, but maybe in the life of following Jesus, being a host and being a guest aren't as far apart as they seem. Maybe they're really two sides of the same coin. Because in places that are shaped by the gospel, in places like Emmanuel AME Church, I think we see those lines become blurred. I think we see in those places that it's possible both to be a welcoming host and a gracious guest at the same time. Both to know that we have something important to offer and that we stand in need of others and of their offerings. It all comes down to trusting that God is big enough to hold us and to hold others we meet. That God is big enough to be at work in their lives, just as in ours. You'll be sent out of here today with the words, "Go in peace and serve the Lord," as you always are. And maybe today when you hear those words, you can think of yourself being sent both ways. Both to host others with God's presence and to be guest to that gracious presence wherever it may show up. You are sent in both ways because following Jesus is always about both. About realizing that we hold a precious, precious gift meant to be offered. And also about realizing that we too are beggars in need of the grace that is present all around. Amen.